Well, welcome back. We are excited to be here for our final keynote, and I'm particularly excited to be presenting with my colleague Andy Wolfe and co-author who will be joining me for this final session. And the title of our final session is Flourishing Together, Students, Educators, and Schools. You'll remember from this morning this model, and really the first keynote focused on the 5 domains of purpose, relationships, teaching and learning, expertise and resources, and well-being. But what we're going to do in this final session is actually to zoom into the center of the model. And so if you look closely at this, you'll see flourishing students at the center, you'll see flourishing educators encircling that, and then flourishing schools encircling that. And the idea, what we're trying to represent visually, is this ecology of flourishing, this flourishing together picture, that we all flourish in this same environment together. So what I'd like to do is share a wonderful video that's been an inspiration both for Andy and myself. This is by Bishop Rose Hudson Wilkin, who is the first woman of color who serves as a bishop in the Church of England. And we'd love for you to listen to this video, which will give us some inspiration about flourishing together.
I am delighted to be with you for your assembly today. In the story of creation, God looked at all that He had created, including humankind, and said,
So we see foregrounded in this video the idea that we flourish together and not alone. And we are grateful to Bishop Rose for this message. We actually asked her for permission to use this as the foreword for our book, and she graciously gave us that permission. So you can certainly go ahead and read that when you get the book. We see, again, there's this ecology of flourishing educators, flourishing students, and flourishing schools. And at this point, I'd love to invite Andy to come and speak to us about the first, which is flourishing educators.
Lynn, thank you so much. It's great to be with you all today. One of the most common things that we find when we're talking about flourishing is that we focus on the flourishing of students, and so a school should. So a school should have that at the heart of its mission, the flourishing of the young people it's seeking to serve. But unless we also focus on the flourishing of educators, we may well be missing the point. And this is why we've designed this ecology of flourishing, where we're bringing together the flourishing of students, the flourishing of educators, and the flourishing of schools. I'm going to focusing on the flourishing of educators to start with. And we've got this very simple quotation: where there are few flourishing adults, there will be few flourishing children. Where there are few flourishing adults, there will be few flourishing children. And I don't know whether when you think about that in your school context, whether that resonates, whether that gives you a sense of a new priority to focus on the adults as well as the children. This season that we have been moving through internationally, nationally, locally through COVID has shown time and again on a daily basis that the flourishing of adults is integral to the flourishing of young people, even through the most challenging times. And part of that is around how we sustain our vision through the most challenging times. When we think about the idea of vision or purpose, and that's central, one of our 5 domains of flourishing, it's really common to think, how do we create that vision? How do we enact it? How do we birth it? How do we communicate it? But actually, the real mark of a vision is not how it's created, but how it is sustained. On this slide, we're trying to unpack the entire Old Testament narrative in 3 simple sentences, which is a brave thing to do, for sure. But it says this: the story of the people of Israel in the Old Testament is one of sustaining vision. It's not a story that just keeps on getting better until a dramatic climax where all the fanfares play and the fireworks go off. It's one of sustaining vision through challenging seasons. There are times of revelation, dedication, flourishing, literal mountaintop experiences, life-changing, culture-shifting, world-shaking events that echo right through history. But also long periods of confusion, suffering, and patience. Timescales we can hardly imagine in our own school context. Tens of years, decades, even centuries where it's not clear where things are headed. And sometimes our flourishing is not simply that everything's going well, but actually understanding what is happening to us in the challenge. There are people who experience the elation and success, those amazing moments where everything seems to be going so well, but others who never get to see the future towards which they're leading. Think of Moses, leading the people of Israel for all of that time, trying to get to a particular place and then being so close to arriving there, only to die before that happened. It's quite a dramatic picture and not one that I'm trying to portray might happen in a school, but nonetheless, the idea of sustaining vision is integral to the flourishing of adults. While good leaders create vision, great leaders sustain it. We show that hope is sticking around. Hope is such an important part of our flourishing, showing a vision for the future that does not yet exist. But leaders who are able to do that, they provide consistency, dependability, reliability for the long term. They don't swerve around the challenge. They know where they're going in the dark. They show that resilience is not simply coping or working harder, but actually that we're changed and transformed in the crucible of the challenge. That's a metaphor from the science laboratory, the crucible, the place where heat comes, when transformation comes under pressure as the temperature rises. And for many of us in our leadership, that is a key factor often in our flourishing. We don't necessarily seek it. We don't necessarily arrive at school in the morning thinking, goodness, I really hope something goes wrong today just so I can grow. We probably don't think that. But nonetheless, when things do go wrong, when those darker days do arrive, when those challenging experiences come up, whether it be as an individual or as a team, it's actually often when we grow the most. And in fact, for a team, while we would not seek those darker days, often when we look back, those most challenging moments are when God reveals himself most to us, where we understand something of his character and where we grow together. It's a bit of a myth that flourishing is about everything going well, as if you could sort of notice whether someone was flourishing by how happy they looked, or kind of how bouncy they were along the corridor, in the car, in the car. Actually flourishing is about our roots that go deep, that sustain us in the most challenging times as educators. And from that, so our students can flourish too in this ecology. We use this key passage from Jeremiah to think about it. Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends its roots out by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit. Isn't it an amazing verse, an incredible promise? Right in the middle there it says, it does not fear when heat comes. It could so easily say it does not fear if heat comes. If things go wrong, we won't fear. It says when heat comes, when the challenge is upon us. That will happen to you in your leadership. It will happen to you in your teams. And that's not a depressing message. It's just a real message. It's a deeply Christian message, in fact. Jesus' promise of life in all its fullness is not life in all its fullness, the good bits only. Life in all its fullness is the ups and downs, the twists and turns, the pain, the sorrow, the joy, the elation, the dancing, the mourning, the weeping. And that's a lot of what we understand flourishing to be. Flourishing is down to our roots. Often when we see a tree or a forest, the most obvious thing we see is what's above the surface. Things look good. They look sturdy, but actually what sustains that tree is what is beneath. And we need to take time and pay attention as leaders to invest in our roots if we are truly to flourish. It's not an easy thing to do. It's an easy thing to let slip, in fact, not least because we are in a sector that is so busy all of the time, where there are tasks upon tasks upon tasks, and we can easily let those roots slip. And when the challenge comes, we're much more vulnerable to it. But we need to be deliberate about that and invest in our own flourishing and the educators that we work with so that we can sustain ourselves in the more difficult times. The Apostle Paul writes many letters to the early church in the New Testament, and one of the most revelatory ones, one of the most beautiful ones, one of the most powerful ones is the second letter to the church in Corinth. Scholars think that church was about 5 years old when the letter was written, and a relatively small size, meeting in people's homes, maybe 50 or 60 people at most. We have this kind of image of churches in the Bible being giant organizations that, those were the big places that got the letters written to them. When actually, here we are in Corinth, a simple port town in ancient Greece. And Paul the Apostle, the great hero of the early church, the pioneer, the founder of so many Christian communities, in some ways the most successful church planter of all time, finds himself in a crisis, and it's an unexpected one. And we find in Paul a deep sense of vulnerability that we do not necessarily expect to see in our leadership heroes. Often we kind of think that flourishing is about everything going well. Leadership is about being the most effective, successful leader, when actually what Paul reveals to us is something of what it means for the Holy Spirit to be at work in us in the most challenging times. When we think of some of the verses that we can draw from this letter, and I'd highly recommend you read it. Not just as a verse by verse, but just sit down and read it. Imagine it was a letter written to the church that you were part of. In it, Paul says this: we were under pressure far beyond our ability to endure. I don't know whether you've ever felt like that in your leadership or your teaching. Under pressure far beyond our ability to endure, where you're carrying a weight, carrying a burden that just feels like too much, where there's no obvious answer. He goes on to say, we had no rest, but we were harassed at every turn, conflicts on the outside, fears within. And sometimes our education system can feel very much like that. Yet, therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart. We do not lose heart. Paul brings it all together in this really famous metaphor that he uses in this letter, the metaphor of jars of clay. It's a clever metaphor because Corinth at this time was known for its pottery trade. If you wanted to get some fantastic luxury, high-end pottery, Corinth was the place to shop. It was known for exquisite, valuable, priceless, highly opulent pottery. And yet Paul turns that local image around into this beautiful metaphor of vulnerability in our faith, vulnerability in our leadership, to say that we hold this incredible treasure of our faith in God. We hold it in something very normal, a simple clay pot, a jar of clay, on the same kind of pot that would be on any shelf in any kitchen in Corinth, to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. And he goes on to say this, which is so important to our flourishing: we are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, but not abandoned. We are struck down, but not destroyed. And in the Flourishing Together book that we've put together, we talk about these metaphors in detail to help us understand something about our flourishing as educators in the most challenging times. When you look into the Greek, it's fascinating to know that some of the words here have sort of hidden meanings that we don't necessarily see revealed in the English. Hard pressed on every side, literally meaning to be under pressure. It's a scientific word. It's the same word that's used to talk about a grape being crushed in a vineyard. When you try and crush a grape, you expect it to be squished. You expect some juice to come. That's what's going to happen. You're hard pressed, but not crushed. Perplexed, it means to not have an obvious answer. And I wonder how many times in your leadership or your teaching you don't have an obvious answer. I'm quite sure that through managing through COVID, that's been a daily experience of not having an obvious answer. But even though the answer is not clear, we're not in despair. We're persecuted, but not abandoned. And lastly, we're struck down, but not destroyed. That word struck down, a military word that Paul is using there, which literally means to be knocked out of shape. The image that he's drawing on there is a Roman military image of what is called the tortoise. It's a military formation. You may have taught it in your classes, whereby the cohort of soldiers would have the shields on the sides, on the top, on the front, and on the back. And it was a defensive formation that enabled that cohort of soldiers to move effectively, but not be vulnerable to attack. What the word here means, struck down, is knocked out of shape. And as soon as one part of that tortoise, the testudo, was knocked out of shape, everyone becomes vulnerable, but yet not destroyed. And it's fascinating that Paul uses we, not I. Sometimes we think our flourishing is all about how we're doing, how an individualized approach to flourishing. How are you doing? It's an individual question, whereas actually our vision for flourishing is a social construct. It's something we do together. It's a journey that we take together. We're codependent. We need one another. And Paul paints this picture of the we, not the I, of flourishing. And this grammar of the but not is so important. And when we're talking about this in terms of our flourishing, we might imagine almost rewriting this, saying we are this but not that. We are this but not that. And our ability to dwell in the but not, in the uncertainty, in the challenge, is actually what our flourishing is about. We say we, not I. Flourishing as a social construct, not an individual measurement. It's something that we assess together. It's something that we do together. It's not one person on their own. It's something that is a community activity and built in relationship. Dwelling in the but not, it means not fearing when the heat comes. We're formed in that crucible of the challenge. And lastly, that idea of jars of clay shows us that flourishing is neither contingent on our circumstances nor equivalent to our happiness or success. The education system sort of seems to tell us everything should be getting better all the time, and I really hope and pray that things are in your school. But if they're not, or you're facing a particular challenge, both individually or corporately or relationally, flourishing is still there for you. Flourishing is still there for you because we flourish together, not alone. And as educators, that's so important. When we think about the flourishing of students, the second part of this ecology, it's very similar in some ways. Students need a greater, more expansive vision for learning than sometimes we offer them. And one of the ways we can think about this is in terms of their character development, their faith formation, the very nature of who they are, which is often formed in the most difficult times in some ways. And in most normal classrooms, you'll see a direct causal relationship between character and achievement. You know, if I'm a student, I'm trying to decide whether to take a risk in learning. And after all, unless I take a risk, all I'm doing is repeating what I can already do. That's all that's happening. Students love to do it. Love to do another task that's the same as what I can already do. Adults are the same. We love to do things that we feel competent in and feel that we won't be exposed in, whereas actually a great teacher provides the opportunity for students to take a risk and build their character. We talk about kind of performance under pressure. My background is as a music teacher, and frequently when I would ask young people to come, stand in front of the whole group and sing or play or whatever, it's actually a really challenging experience if you're 12. It's a really difficult thing to do. But actually, if your character is formed by the way you're taught, then you're far more likely to flourish in that sense. That acronym there, TCUP, on the slide, it stands for thinking correctly under pressure. When we're under pressure, we don't necessarily always think straight, do we? We make crazy decisions. Sometimes they're reactive, sometimes they're too responsive, sometimes they're too rushed. Whereas actually, great teaching trains young people to think correctly under pressure and take those risks. Sometimes our education system does not help our students or their mental health one little bit because it transfers pressure or fear down the kind of ecology of the system, from the macro, the kind of governmental level or the governance level, into the school, putting pressure on school leaders to perform at greater and greater heights. Schools then inadvertently can put pressure on their teachers, and teachers inadvertently, not intentionally, but inadvertently can transfer that sense of fear onto the pupil. And actually, we're seeing more and more of that happen, and more vulnerability in terms of people's mental health issues. And actually, instead of being a school or a teacher that transfers fear, our vision for flourishing is that we should be a group of people who transfer hope. I mean, imagine if you had to introduce yourself to someone at a party and you said, well, what do you do for a living? You say, I transfer hope. I give hope to people. That's what I do in my classroom every day. It's what I do as a school leader, my faculty. I transfer hope. I take that. I build character. And instead of bringing fear, we're bringing hope. And that's a really fantastic vision for the flourishing of students. For students to really have that depth of flourishing, they need this kind of secure base from which to operate. Strong relationships, secure attachment, deepening sense of availability and sensitivity, and even family membership. Some of that comes before any pedagogy is possible, in fact. And sometimes we need to take time to build those relationships first to enable those flourishing students to actually do so. There's an amazing book about this called Know Me to Teach Me. It's by a friend of mine called Louise Bomber. And in it, she talks about the route to learning, the route in terms of the cognitive science from the reptilian brain, which is our kind of instinctive fight or flight kind of response, to that neocortex understanding of where we actually learn. And what she says in that is unless we've got that strength of relationship, and that's the idea of regulation, it's very difficult to get to that learning. And this is particularly true for vulnerable students or those who've experienced some kind of trauma earlier in life. And if we're really to see young people flourish and to be part of that ecology of flourishing, we need to be really deliberate about providing that idea to regulate, to relate, to reason, and to repair before we dive in to learning. So this ecology of flourishing, the idea of flourishing adults, flourishing students, what is it that we are seeking? What is it that we're aiming for? You can probably tell by my accent that I am from England, and I have this very exciting role overseeing the Church of England's approach to education. And in the very tip-top corner of England is a small city called Durham. You may have visited it, and this is a picture of the cathedral in Durham. It's a vast cavernous building built in the Norman period of history, which is quite a few years ago. And I studied there as a student, as an undergraduate, and I used to walk past this every day, and I used to wonder like something of the history of that building. And when I researched into it, I found that from the time of the architect signing off the plans to Durham Cathedral opening was a period of 37 years. 37 years, which might make some of your school building projects seem fairly straightforward. The architect, we think, was around age 40 when he signed off the plans. So what did the architect know for sure when he signed off those plans? He knew that he would never see the cathedral that he had designed. A sad story for architecture, you could say, but actually a really powerful metaphor for how we think about flourishing students and flourishing adults and flourishing schools. This idea of building a cathedral, investing in something that is much broader, deeper, more expansive in terms of its vision than simply seeing young people do well in their academic tests. Something that invests for the long term in terms of their character and teaches them that their flourishing comes both in the good times and the challenging seasons that they will face. So as we've built this ecology of flourishing between flourishing schools, flourishing educators and flourishing adults, we hope that that is a really useful picture for you to bring. And I'm now going to invite Lynn back to talk to us finally about the flourishing schools element of it. Lynn.
Well, thanks, Andy, and I will be talking about flourishing schools. We'll return to our scripture that we began with, which is John 10:10. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Some of your translations may say abundant life. And the question that we're seeking to ask and seeking to answer is, what does abundant life look like educationally? So what does educational abundance look like in your school that is from a Christian vision and is given and blessed by Jesus? And so I want to actually suggest to you a practice. It's a bit of a spiritual practice and a bit of an educational practice. And this is something actually that our schools, we've suggested to, they've tried it and found it to be extremely powerful and a little bit different from the typical assessment strategies that you may be used to. And this is called Flourishing Schools Walks in the Garden. And this is actually taken directly from the book. The Bible was written during an expansive time period in which people were significantly more acquainted with agriculture than many are today. Jesus tells numerous parables and employs metaphors related to gardening: sowing, planting, watering, harvesting, pruning. In John's Gospel, Jesus says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful." And in Luke's Gospel, when a frustrated landowner wants to cut down a fig tree that hasn't yet borne fruit, the gardener replies, "Leave it alone for one more year, and I'll dig around it and fertilize it. If it bears fruit next year, fine, and if not, then cut it down." To think about how insights from agriculture might apply in your school, we suggest that you assemble a team who will take regular learning walks. Much as you would walk around a public garden and stop in to notice the diverse plants, landscapes, and biomes, send your team members out for a set period of time, perhaps an hour, to take a walk through and around the school, perhaps once or twice a month. As you and the team walk, Write down observations about places you and they observed educational flourishing in action. Places where additional sunlight or water might be needed to revive growth. Places where tiny green shoots are barely visible, but they're there. Places that seem to be overgrown with maybe too much activity and are in need of pruning back. Or places that are currently dormant or fallow, but that show promise for future cultivation. Encourage yourself not just to look for public displays, such as a well-polished lesson or a chapel sermon, but to seek out the quieter, the subtler garden beds, such as the interaction between students during cooperative work, the layout and flow of the lunchroom, or the engagement of teachers and custodial staff. Remind yourselves and those with whom you may come into contact while walking that this is not a formal observation, but rather an invitation to see in a new and different way, with a non-punitive set of lenses of a gardener who has the holistic, vibrant, bountiful flourishing of the garden in mind, and be sure to invite students to walk too. After each walk, gather to share observations, uncover common themes, and like wise gardeners, decide how you can best cultivate growth in your school today, as well as to plan for the future. Consider these questions. What evidence did you find that your school is abiding in the vine, Jesus? How did you see your school living out your Christian vision for education? In what places or ways is your school bearing fruit? Where or how is it flourishing well? In what places or ways is your school not bearing fruit? Where or how is it not yet flourishing? And where do you think pruning might be needed so your school can be even more fruitful, so educators and students can flourish even more? And we invite you to take these walks in the garden with your team at your school. We believe that those observations that you prayerfully make and that you work together to observe will actually lead to greater flourishing. I'd like to invite Andy back to offer a blessing to you. This is actually the close of our book, so I guess, Andy, we're kind of giving away some of the end at this point. So, Andy, thanks so much.
Lynn, thank you so much, and thank you so much for taking part in this session, looking at this ecology of flourishing together. We started looking earlier in this session at 2 Corinthians, and we're going to end in looking at a paraphrase of 1 Corinthians 13, that famous hymn of love that Paul writes to the church when he's trying to sum up what is it that he really wants to see from them. And when we've really thought and wrestled and refined down what we think flourishing is about, that sense of love is right at the center. So I'm going to read this to you. May it be a blessing to you. May it be something you can meditate on, something you can use in your schools, something that you can use in your own personal reflection about why you're doing what you're doing and how it might release further flourishing of your students, your educators, and your schools. So this is an educator's paraphrase of 1 Corinthians 13, 1-8. If I tirelessly teach 5 outstanding lessons a day and see my students make excellent progress against their targets but have not love, I am only a broken window or a wall covered in graffiti. If I create the perfect climate for learning, have excellent meetings with parents and resolve all the problems of the day through focused toil but have not love, I am only an uneaten school lunch or a messy office. If I give all I have to my school and work a 70-hour week, grading, planning, preparing, and evaluating, have the most perfect color-coded action plan to guide my path, but have not love, I and my students gain nothing. Love is patient, showing sustained praise and giving students the courage to come back the next day. Love is kind, noticing the lonely, connecting them with a potential new friend, as well as shaping a teacher's welcome to a student who just transferred from another school. It does not envy what other schools or educators or students have, but rather practices gratefulness for the blessings it has been given. It does not boast in external or superficial markers of success that most societies prioritize over a holistic education that leads to a deep and abiding character. It is not proud, refusing to label any student or vocation as beneath its program or study, or any family as undesirable because of their inability to pay. It is not rude, whether by turning a blind eye to the needs of its neighbors or by turning away those who desire to flourish within its community. Love is not self-seeking, instead giving its best resources away to other organizations, seeking their success as keenly as its own. It is not easily angered by differences of perspectives, opinion, doctrine, or politics. Love keeps no record of wrongs, always offering wise, fresh starts and finding grace before remembering fault. Love does not delight in evil, but it rejoices with the truth. Whether redressing disparities and disadvantage or correcting prejudice and injustice, all of which abuse and insult fellow human beings, created in the image of God with equal value and worth. Love always protects. For example, by adapting learning plans for students who've experienced trauma in order to prioritize belonging and safety over knowledge transfer, or by asking patient questions of a colleague struggling with mental health issues. It always trusts, believing in and being vulnerable to others, despite the very human tendency to disappoint and fall short. It always hopes in the most expansive and capacious vision for education possible, reflecting the life in all its fullness that Jesus came to offer. It always perseveres, no matter the level of crisis or the depth of daily challenge it may face. Love never fails in desiring, calling, and enabling us to flourish together.